The Senate gavels back into session with a lot that Congress must do, but with little time to act. In less than a week, the federal government will begin to shut down unless both sides work together to extend funding. Meanwhile, the moral obligation for Congress to help the people of Ukraine and fortify our own national security grows heavier with each passing day. And it's imperative that we make real progress in the coming weeks towards our ultimate goal of finishing the appropriations process. These are just a few of the tasks facing Congress as winter turns to spring. The margin for error on any of these is razor thin. And unfortunately, the temptation to choose chaos and disorder instead of cooperation will be strong for some here in the Capitol. By now, it is clear that when serious-minded Democrats and serious-minded Republicans engage each other with a desire to get things done, with a desire to get to yes, good things happen, even in divided government. We avoid shutdowns. We invest in the American people. We make our country stronger. The Senate ended the last work period with a powerful example of bipartisanship by resoundingly 70 votes passing the National Security Supplemental. It wasn't easy to get it done, but now that we succeeded, it should serve as a model for both chambers moving forward. Over the recess, negotiators in both chambers continue the difficult work of the appropriations process. While we've made some good progress on a number of fronts, unfortunately, our House Republican colleagues are still struggling to figure themselves out. There's a lot of uncertainty over how the House will proceed in the coming days. So I ask all senators to keep their schedules flexible. Now, Senate Democrats have been crystal clear. We want to avoid a government shutdown. We want to work with all our House counterparts to spare the American people of the pain that a shutdown would bring. But for that to happen, congressional leadership must resist the centrifugal pull of extremism emanating from the hard right. We must resist basing our choices on what people like Donald Trump want Congress to do. We need to remember our responsibility to the American people and do our jobs. Even a partial shutdown would mean chaos and pain for the American people. And let me just list a few examples of why that's true. A shutdown of the Agriculture Department would threaten higher food costs for all Americans, threaten critical services for farmers and rural communities, from home ownership programs to food banks, and delay access to critical programs just as spring is arriving. A shutdown of the Veterans Administration would close our veteran outreach offices and thereby freeze critical programs that support our nation's heroes, those who risked their lives for us. A shutdown of the Housing Department would leave American families high and dry without key federal housing loan support, potentially causing rent and housing prices to spike. A shutdown of the Transportation Department would risk travel delays and traveler safety by freezing the hiring of air traffic controllers, as President, you well know. This is just the tip of the iceberg. A shutdown would also throw a wrench into our economic recovery. It would raise costs, just as inflation has returned closer to normal levels. It would make communities less safe. I am hopeful that pragmatic Republicans will engage in responsible governing by working with Democrats to avoid a shutdown this week. Senate Democrats want to do the right thing and keep the government open. I hope the House continues to work with us in good faith to make that happen. But time is short. Time is short.
Now, on another matter, since President Biden took office, consumer prices have risen 17.9%. On his watch, our economy has seen inflation grow at its fastest rate in 4 decades. As prices soared, wages failed to keep up. Paychecks have risen just 14.5%. In other words, the Biden economy has effectively imposed a pay cut across the board. The effects of Washington Democrats' reckless spending have forced working families to do more with less. As the American people struggle to make ends meet, they're carrying record-high credit card debt, 34% more than they were just 3 years ago. And polls continue to report that the country isn't very bullish on the prospects of undoing the Biden administration's damage anytime soon. By one recent survey, fewer than 3 in 10 Americans rate today's economic conditions positively, and barely 1 in 4 expect things to improve over the coming year. So, Madam President, this president's economy is leaving workers feeling suffocated. The effects of historic inflation are inescapable. Even after paying the rent or the mortgage and footing steep utility bills, families still had to put food on the table in the face of a food price surge that's making the wrong sort of history. Since January 2021, nationwide grocery costs have increased 21%. The cost of dining out has increased nearly the same. And by USDA's own figures, grocery budgets are now taking up a larger share of disposable incomes than at any point since 1991. As one woman in suburban Chicago recently told reporters, her family's food costs alone were rising faster than their incomes. And surveys indicate that fully 94% of Americans share her concerns about the prices of food and other consumer goods. This is the Biden economy. This is Bidenomics in action. And bizarrely, this is what the Biden administration has decided to spin as a roaring success. Both the White House and the president's reelection campaign continue to insist he's proud of his economic record. Imagine telling anyone who will listen that today's economy has you and your family in a bind, only for the President of the United States to declare a job well done. Don't get me wrong, the Biden administration is quite keen to assign blame for economic hardships. They're just looking everywhere but in the mirror. On Super Bowl Sunday, in the middle of the worst food budget crisis in a generation, the president himself cut an ad warning that the real problem in American families' pantries was bags of potato chips with fewer chips inside. President Biden calls shrinkflation a ripoff, but the American people know the real ripoff is the historic inflation that shrunk their paychecks and forced them to make tough choices about tomorrow and get through today. In fact, they say so repeatedly. The only question at this point is when Washington Democrats will start listening.
Mr. President, on Ukraine, this past weekend I led a congressional delegation unlike any I've been a part of before to visit with the people of Ukraine as they marked 2 years since the start of Putin's illegal invasion. It was one of the most memorable and moving trips I've ever been on, 3 days that will stay with me for the rest of my life. We traveled to Ukraine because we all felt a deep obligation to be there on the ground, now as the war reaches a pivotal turning point. As President Zelensky said to us, if Ukraine gets the armaments they need, they will win the war. But if they don't get those armaments, they will lose. We went because this is an inflection point in history, the future of Ukraine, but not just Ukraine, Western democracy, hangs in the balance. We went because the Ukrainian people needed to hear directly from us that America stands by their side, that we will not turn their backs on them during their fight for survival. And we went because the nations of Europe must know that America will not abandon them, that we must stay part of NATO, and that we in the Senate will ensure the greatest alliance the world has ever known remains strong and remains prosperous. I thank my colleagues who joined our CODEL, Senators Reid and Blumenthal, Bennett and Hassan. It was an immensely productive and insightful, sobering trip. We were honored above all to meet with President Zelensky whose courage and resolve are an inspiration. He was an amazing man. He still has strength. He still has that optimism that Ukraine can win this war, and he keeps the people together. To watch him was awe-inspiring, a man with so much on his shoulders, moving forward, doing the right thing. and doing it with vigor and without complaint. As I mentioned, during our meeting, the President was blunt. He said if Ukraine gets the aid currently stalled in the House, they'll win the war. But he also said that if Congress does not pass the supplemental, with all the ammo and anti-air defenses and long-range artillery it would provide, they will lose. It was that simple. With aid, Ukraine wins. Without it, they lose. And we learned about the details of what they need. I spoke to a Ukrainian army officer. Their drones are extremely precise. In fact, they're probably even better than the ones we have now. And the drones can find out where the Russian artillery is exactly and precisely. But then they don't have the ammo to take out that Russian artillery because they lack that ammo. So frustrating to this soldier who's doing his job, risking his life. And then we heard another instance that Ukrainian artillery is not as long range now because we haven't given them what they need, and it's in the supplemental, as the Russian artillery. So Russian artillery can fire and take out Ukrainian artillery, but then Ukrainian artillery can't fire back because they don't have the reach of the Russian artillery. We heard these stories over and over again. We learned how the withdrawal of Avdiivka is in large part a consequence of insufficient weaponry. The top Ukrainian generals told us if they would have had adequate armaments, Avdiivka would not have fallen. And now they are being pushed back on the front, but only because, not because they lack courage, not because they lack strength, not because they lack good leadership, but only because they don't have the weaponry they need. We must help them. And any American who thinks, oh, this is far away, it doesn't matter, hasn't learned the lessons of 1938 and 1916. It's not an exact analogy, of course. But back then people said, oh, this is far away, we don't have to pay attention. And in both instances, Americans paid for that lack of foresight, that lack of strength, that lack of vision with lives and, of course, billions and trillions of dollars spent, or certainly billions in those days. And, Madam President, there was no moment more heart-wrenching, no moment better crystallized the stakes and costs of the war than when with the new head of the Ukrainian army, General Syrskyi, we paid a visit to a cemetery dedicated to the courageous Ukrainian dead. 4 months earlier, he told us it was just a parking lot in Lviv, but they needed a place to bury the so many dead. And we walked up and down the grave sites and saw the pictures, men, women, young, old, of the dead on their tombstones. They have a picture on each one. And then if you looked across the way, Ukrainians were busy digging more graves for those they knew who would die in the next few months. It was an amazing, moving moment of the stalwartness of the Ukrainian people, the bravery of the Ukrainian people. So I believe that if every Congress member saw what we saw, heard what we heard, learned what we learned, they would understand the urgency of passing the supplemental. With this urgent aid package, Congress has a chance to ensure Ukraine wins the war, to ensure Putin is not victorious, to ensure that Western democracy can thrive in the 21st century. And let me say, if our allies see that America doesn't support its ally Ukraine, they will no longer be our allies. They will know that they cannot depend on America. And even worse, if the autocrats, the vicious dictators like Putin, like Xi, like the heads of North Korea and Iran, see that the United States will turn away from a challenge like this, they will be emboldened. So anyone who thinks that, oh, this is far away, this does not have consequences for the American people, are wrong. If we turn away from Ukraine over the next decade and several decades, the American people and America will pay the price diplomatically, politically, economically, militarily. It's a moment. History's looking at us. So we must do it. I urged Speaker Johnson to go visit and see what I saw. No person of any decent conscience and sight would vote no if they saw what we saw. I hope the Speaker does the right thing. I hope he puts the supplemental that we passed here in the Senate with 70 votes on the floor of the House. I am confident, absolutely confident, that if Speaker Johnson were to put this supplemental on the floor, it would pass with strong bipartisan support, like it did in the Senate. I hope, I pray, for the sake of our values, for the sake of our country, for the sake of the brave people in Ukraine and those who have died in this war, I hope Speaker Johnson recognizes that history is watching us and watching him, that the world is watching, that if he does the wrong thing, I am confident he will regret it in years to come, no matter what the political outcome. And I am hopeful that Speaker Johnson will not just, in blind obeisance to Donald Trump, do what just about everyone who studies this issue knows is the wrong thing, and not give Ukraine the aid it needs.